Thank you and good afternoon. I want to begin by asking you to do two things with me for the next few minutes, which are going to sound a little uncharacteristic coming from someone from the federal government. First of all, I want you to use your imagination. Second, I want to ask you to think boldly about the issues that we're going to talk about now. So first, imagine this with me. Imagine that in our country we try to cure polio by buying more wheelchairs and crutches, as opposed to buying more vaccines to keep the disease at bay in the first place. Where would we be? Imagine that we try to protect automobile drivers and passengers by buying more ambulances to get them to the hospital faster, rather than buying more seat belts, airbags, and other safety features. And because we always have to have a sports reference, if you're from the Southeastern Conference, you've got to have a sports reference. Imagine that we keep athletes on the field safe by buying more neck braces and ice packs, as opposed to buying more shoulder pads and football helmets. Where would we be? Now imagine this with me. Imagine that we protect our most vulnerable children in our country from child abuse and neglect by buying more foster care beds for them after they've been abused and neglected, rather than investing in the capacity of their parents to keep them safe from harm in the first place. What would that look like if that were the case? I'll tell you. It would look like 437,000 children in foster care and going up. It would look like 4 million reports of child abuse and neglect every year. Because that is the case. That's what we do in our country. Yes, child welfare is a very complex situation, and all the situations that we have to deal with in child welfare don't lend themselves to a seatbelt or a vaccine. But so often we focus our efforts on the effects of child abuse and neglect rather than the causes, on the symptoms rather than the cure, on reacting after it's occurred rather than proactively trying to prevent it from occurring in the first place. Despite having a sincere desire in many situations and the know-how to intervene sooner to support and strengthen the capacity of families, oftentimes our funding, our programs, our policies, sometimes our very values get in the way of us doing that. If we're serious about looking at ways that we can strengthen the capacity of families in our country, we have to reimagine what we expect out of our child welfare system and what we're looking for in terms of the outcomes and what we're looking for in terms of the funding and what it can buy and what it may not buy for us. Attorneys, judges, the entire legal judicial community has a tremendous role, responsibility in that area. And no, that's not the beginning of a lawyer joke, although I might be tempted to go there under other circumstances. The legal judicial community, in collaboration with child welfare agencies, has a tremendous responsibility to ensure that we don't admit children into the foster care system unless it's absolutely necessary and unless their parents have access to the critical services they need to prevent that. And when it is necessary, we have an opportunity to make sure that the well-being of families remains on the forefront of all the work that we're doing. We have to jointly own the outcomes that we are trying to achieve for children and families. And I want to give you a few areas, a few examples, if you will, of where we can jointly own that responsibility going forward. The first one is that we can, as a system, retool, refocus our efforts on the primary prevention of child abuse and neglect in our country. When I talk about prevention, I'm not talking about preventing the reoccurrence of maltreatment after it's already occurred, although that is critically important. But I'm talking about preventing the initial occurrence of maltreatment before children are harmed. I get a lot of opportunities in this job that I'm fortunate to have to go around the country and talk about this subject. And every time I do it without fail, you know what? I get heads nodding. I get big, broad smiles. I get once in a while a you go guy out there because people like to hear that. It reminds me of me sitting at home whenever I have the chance to be at home with my 4 dogs lined up beside me, sleeping soundly, dreaming of, dog bones, chasing rabbits, whatever. I can say one word and change all of that. You know what that word is? Walk. I can say walk in a normal tone of voice. I've got 4 dogs leaping off the couch. I've got tails wagging. I've got barking with excitement going on. I've got salivating. I've got running around flips. Why is that? It's because the idea of the walk is grand. It conjures up images of what dogs are supposed to do. They're supposed to go for walks, right? But then we go outside after we get the leashes on, and guess what? It's 100 degrees. And the humidity is 100%. And it's Florida. And it's in July. And all of a sudden, I don't see tails wagging and I don't hear barking dogs anymore. I see 4 dogs with their butts planted firmly on the ground, looking at me, saying, I don't think so. I'm uncomfortable. I want to go back in the air conditioning. Put me back on the couch. Give me another treat, maybe 2, maybe 3. Chico says, I'll have a 4th jerky treat, please. We'll go for a walk another day. It's the same way when we talk about primary prevention. I can say primary prevention in the child welfare community, and I get tails wagging. I get barking with excitement. Why? Because it conjures up images of what we as a system say that we're designed to do. After all, we put it on our brochures, don't we? Prevent child abuse. It's on our public service announcements. We talk about it. That's what we're here to actually do. But then when we walk outside in the heat and the humidity and the discomfort of having to face giving up critical things in order to reimagine a system that's focused on primary prevention, our excitement wanes. We don't want to give up funding that frankly only buys us more foster care beds, but doggone it, we can get as many of those foster care beds as we need, can't we? We don't want to give up a practice that doesn't give us the outcomes that we're looking for, but we know that practice. And as a child welfare agency or a court or a set of legal representatives, we don't always want to give up the independence that we have to do to collaborate and to work together in order to make that change. But it doesn't have to be that way, does it? We could be bold. We could think about primary prevention and commit ourselves to that kind of agenda and change our practice. Primary prevention of child maltreatment. Imagine that. The second area, the second example where we can share that enormous responsibility is in the foster care system itself, because it'll always be necessary in the most egregious situations that we have out there. I want you to imagine this with me. Imagine the experience of a child coming into the foster care system who, first of all, gets to stay in the same community that she's from without having to give up all that's familiar to her. Imagine her mom coming into that foster home, not once a week, but on a daily basis, and with the support, the help, the guidance of the foster parents, is able to do what parents do for their kids. Help her with her homework. Help her get to bed, get her bath at night. Kiss her goodnight before she goes to bed. Be there in the morning to help walk her to school. Imagine that mom and those foster parents sitting together watching this child's school performance or athletic performance, and then compare that to the experience of a child who gets to visit with her mother once a week in an agency visiting room with a social worker sitting over in the corner watching that happen. We can share the responsibility for ensuring that that doesn't happen. And one of the ways we can do that is by never allowing parent-child visitation to be used as reward and punishment for the parent's compliance or lack of compliance. By ensuring that both the parents and the children have adequate legal representation that puts their rights out there and that advocates for and helps to ensure that kind of a foster care experience rather than the one that we most often are able to experience. So I'm going to give you a third example where we can share a reimagined view of child welfare in our country, and that's in our focus on the overall well-being of children and families. So I've devoted, how many years now of my life trying to master the Spanish language with only very limited results. But one of the striking things to me about it is that the term for child welfare in the Spanish language is bienestar de los niños, or bienestar de menores, well-being of the children. In our reimagined view of child welfare, could that not also be bienestar de las familias, well-being of the families, bienestar de todo el mundo, well-being of all of us, because we're all connected, and because with the slightest stroke of fate, any of us could need what we call child welfare services. So often in our work, we achieve physical safety of children at the expense of their psychological and their emotional well-being, and it doesn't have to be that way in a reimagined view of child welfare that focuses on well-being. A fourth example that I want to share with you where we can share this vision moving forward is in strengthening the capacity of communities to support the children and families that live there and to provide the critical services that they need before child welfare involvement and in some situations after child welfare involvement. So I get personal again. I grew up in a very remote area of Alabama, miles from the nearest town, somewhat isolated. I loved it up to a certain point. But even the ordinary things became huge challenges. Getting my car fixed, which needed to happen all the time. Getting the propane gas tank refilled out in the yard. Getting repairs made on the house when things went wrong. These were challenges, but were not necessarily insurmountable challenges for me because I had the support of some extended family. I had the support of a community that knew me, that cared about me, and could help me when I need it. But for so many of the families that we work with, those kind of everyday things, those kinds of challenges can be insurmountable. And they can lead to bad things happening to children and families. They can lead to family disruption. But wonderful things can happen when communities come together to support the children and the families that they live there. Imagine this with me. Imagine a mom whose children are in foster care under the care and protection of a community-based agency who comes into that agency with her neighbor who's having some trouble just to show the neighbor around. And they can help you with this. If you need housing, here's where you go to get this. If you need legal assistance to keep from getting evicted, to keep from getting your utilities turned off, with some of your immigration issues, they can help you with this. Why? Who would imagine that a mom would come to the agency that has removed her children from her to show her neighbor around and say, these people can help you? I experienced that within the last couple of months in that kind of an agency. And the reason is because that mom felt supported in that environment. She felt like she was getting her needs met, that somebody cared about her. And I know that for the last 40 or so years, that agency has committed itself to serving this community and the people in it. It can happen. The fifth and final area that I want to share with you where we can jointly own this responsibility for reimagining our child welfare system is in the area of our workforce. And when I talk about workforce, I'm not talking about just the social workers who populate the child welfare agencies out there, although that's usually where our minds go. I'm talking about the attorneys who represent children and parents and agencies, the advocates, the service providers, all of us who touch the lives of children and families. We have to ensure that our workforce is as resilient and healthy as we want our children and families to be, and we have an enormous responsibility to make sure that happens. I want you to imagine this with me. Imagine a young man about 18 years old, recently emancipated from foster care, who, when I interviewed him and asked him about the relationship that he had with his social worker, he looked at me very frankly and said, "She saved my life." I must have had a puzzled look on my face, because he went on to tell me about how she had supported him through behavior problems, placement moves, relationship issues, drug issues, helped him to get his high school education and then into vocational training. And then on that day of our interview was coming by to pick him up and take him to his job, because my interview with him was interfering with the public transportation system that he was dependent upon. How many children and families out there do you think would say about any of us, "They saved my life"? He said, "I'm not kidding. She saved my life." And I believed him. We have a tremendous opportunity before us right now to reimagine what child welfare can be in our country. But as long as we so disproportionately fund foster care at the expense of strengthening families through primary prevention, we should expect to get precisely the outcomes that we're getting right now. There will never be enough foster homes to meet the need. There will never be enough therapists to fix all the trauma. There will never be enough social workers and lawyers to represent all the children. There will never be enough money in state coffers to meet the growing demands. And the government will never be as good a parent to children as their own families can be. And it shouldn't be. But we can reimagine the ways in which we strengthen children and families. And we can make that imagination our reality. We can do it by cultivating a jointly owned, shared vision and commitment to making strengthening families our primary mission in the broad child welfare system. We can do it by insisting upon flexibility in our funding, in our programs, in our policies, in our values, to reorient and balance the most critical needs of children who have been maltreated with the opportunity to prevent them from being maltreated. And we can trust that states and local governments know the needs of their families a lot better than we do in the federal government. As a nation, we're only as strong as our families. And I would say we have the opportunity right now to share a conviction that strong families are absolutely our best hope of keeping children safe and protected in our country. Thank you.